Hey everyone, hope you're having a great day. You're listening to the RX Daily Dose. Today's episode is being recorded for Wednesday, February 24th, and I'm your host, Ian Parnagoni. We update this podcast for healthcare providers, medical professionals, and anyone who has an interest in drug updates. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all your favorite podcast platforms and social media, including iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram. All links can be found in the show notes below. So in today's episode, we'll be discussing the approval of Ukoniq for specific types of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and approval of Evkeeza as add-on therapy in treating LDL bad cholesterol. We'll also be discussing the approval of Cosela given before chemotherapy to reduce the risk of bone marrow suppression. And as always, feel free to skip around. I'm going to include times in the show notes so you get the drugs that interest you. First up this week, the FDA approved umbralisib, which goes by brand name Ukoniq, for the treatment of adult patients with relapsed or refractory marginal zone lymphoma who have received at least one prior anti-CD20 based regimen, and adult patients with relapsed or refractory follicular lymphoma who have received at least 3 prior lines of systemic therapy. Marginal zone lymphoma is a group of slow-growing mature B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphomas. MZL is generally considered a chronic and incurable disease, with an annual incidence of approximately 8,200 newly diagnosed patients in the U.S., MZL is the third most common B-cell NHL, accounting for approximately 10% of all NHL cases. Follicular lymphoma is the second most common form of NHL. It is generally not curable and is considered a chronic disease, as patients can live for many years with this form of lymphoma. With an annual incidence in the U.S. of approximately 13,200 newly diagnosed patients, FL is the most common slow-growing lymphoma, accounting for approximately 17% of NHL cases. Ukoniq is the first and only oral once-daily inhibitor of phosphoinositide 3 kinase delta and casein kinase 1 epsilon. PI3K delta is known to play an important role in supporting cell proliferation and survival, cell differentiation, intracellular trafficking, and immunity, and is expressed in both normal and malignant B cells. CK1 epsilon is a regulator of oncoprotein translation and has been implicated in the pathogenesis of cancer cells, including lymphoid malignancies. Accelerated approval was granted for these indications based on overall response rate data from the Phase 2 Unity NHL trial. Approval was based on 2 single-arm cohorts of the trial in 69 patients with marginal zone lymphoma who received at least one prior therapy, including an anti-CD20 containing regimen, and in 117 patients with follicular lymphoma after at least 2 prior systemic therapies. In MZL, an overall response rate of 49% with 16% complete responses, and in FL, an overall response rate of 43% and 3% complete responses were achieved respectively. Patients received Ukoniq 800 milligrams once daily until disease progression or unacceptable toxicity. Serious adverse reactions occurred in 18% of patients who received Ukoniq in the trial and included diarrhea colitis, pneumonia, sepsis, and urinary tract infection. The most common adverse reactions included lab abnormalities, musculoskeletal pain, upper respiratory tract infection, vomiting, abdominal pain, decreased appetite, and rash. Continued approval of these indications may be contingent upon verification and description of clinical benefit in a confirmatory trial. This application was granted priority review for the MZL indication. In addition, Ukoniq was granted breakthrough therapy designation for the treatment of MZL and orphan drug designation for the treatment of MZL and FL. The FDA also approved evinacumab, which goes by brand name Evkeeza, as an adjunct to other low-density lipoprotein cholesterol-lowering therapies to treat adult and pediatric patients aged 12 years and older with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. Evkeeza is the first FDA-approved treatment that binds to and blocks the function of angiopoietin-like 3, a protein that plays a key role in lipid metabolism. Homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, also known as HoFH, is an ultra-rare inherited condition that affects approximately 1,300 patients in the U.S. HoFH occurs when two copies of the familial hypercholesterolemia-causing genes are inherited, one from each parent, resulting in dangerously high levels of LDL bad cholesterol, typically higher than 400 milligrams per deciliter. Patients with HoFH are at risk for premature atherosclerotic disease and cardiac events as early as their teenage years. Evkeeza is a fully human monoclonal antibody that binds to and blocks the function of angiopoietin-like 3. The FDA approval is based on results from the Phase 3 ELLIPSE HoFH trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in August of 2020. In the trial, 65 patients were randomized to receive either Evkeeza, 15 milligrams per kilogram IV, every 4 weeks, plus other lipid-lowering therapies, compared to lipid-lowering therapies alone. The mean baseline LDL level of patients in both groups was 255 milligrams per deciliter. The trial met its primary endpoint, with Evkeeza-treated patients reducing their LDL-C from baseline by 49% on average compared to placebo at week 24. At the same time, compared to baseline, Evkeeza-treated patients also experienced a 132 milligram per deciliter average reduction in LDL-C compared to placebo. Reductions in LDL-C seen with Evkeeza were observed as early as week 2 and maintained throughout the double-blind treatment period and open-label trial period. The most common adverse reactions reported from the combined safety analysis were nasopharyngitis, influenza-like illness, dizziness, rhinorrhea, nausea, and extremity pain. In clinical trials, adverse reactions led to discontinuation of treatment in only 2% of patients treated with Evkeeza, including one case of anaphylaxis that resolved with treatment, and 2% of patients who received placebo. The FDA evaluated Evkeeza under priority review following the decision in 2017 to grant Evkeeza breakthrough therapy designation for the treatment of hypercholesterolemia in patients with HoFH. The FDA reserves its priority review for medicines that represent significant improvements in safety or efficacy in treating serious conditions, and its breakthrough therapy designation is designed to expedite the development of U.S. review of drugs that target serious or life-threatening conditions. The FDA also approved trilaciclib, which goes by brand name Cosela, as the first therapy in its class to reduce the frequency of chemotherapy-induced bone marrow suppression in adults receiving certain types of chemotherapy for extensive-stage small cell lung cancer. Cosela may help protect bone marrow cells from damage caused by chemotherapy by inhibiting cyclin-dependent kinase 4/6, a type of enzyme. Despite the ever-growing use of targeted oncology drugs, chemotherapy is still widely used in lung cancer, and it still comes with potentially severe side effects. Chemotherapy drugs are designed to kill cancer cells but can damage normal tissue as well. The bone marrow is particularly susceptible to chemotherapy damage. The bone marrow makes red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets that transport oxygen, fight infection, and stop bleeding. When damaged, the bone marrow produces fewer of these cells, leading to fatigue, increased risk of infection, and bleeding, among other problems. The indication for Cosela calls for administration before platinum, etoposide, or topotecan containing regimens for adults with extensive stage small cell lung cancer. Cosela should be given as a 30-minute IV infusion no more than 4 hours before chemotherapy administration to provide proactive, multi-lineage protection from chemotherapy-induced myelosuppression. The effectiveness of Cosela was evaluated in 3 double-blind, placebo-controlled studies in patients with extensive stage small cell lung cancer. Combined, these studies randomly assigned 245 patients to receive either an infusion of Cosela or a placebo before chemotherapy. The studies then compared the 2 groups for the proportion of patients with severe neutropenia and the duration of severe neutropenia in the first cycle of chemotherapy. In all 3 studies, patients who received Cosela had a lower chance of having severe neutropenia compared to patients who received a placebo. Among those who had severe neutropenia, patients who received Cosela on average had it for a shorter time than patients who received placebo. The most common side effects for Cosela include fatigue, low levels of calcium, potassium, and phosphate, increased levels of an enzyme called aspartate aminotransferase, headache, and infection in the lungs. Patients should also be advised about injection site reactions, acute drug hypersensitivity, interstitial lung disease, and embryo-fetal toxicity. And that's all I have for right now. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'll include all links in the show notes below, so please go back and check those out too. Please connect with me on any of your social media platforms and give me feedback on what you heard today. I'd love to know what you thought about the episode. And as always, feel free to like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe out there, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.